Hello, everyone, and good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Historians Lounge here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Many of you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us today is an historian and author making their official debut here on the show. Now, my guest today is an historian and author whose work examines how myth, faith, and identity echo across generations. His writing draws on the layered religious and political histories of Europe, where pre-Christian gods and ancestral memory continue to move beneath the surface of modern life. He's interested in the ways faith becomes power, how nations are shaped by the stories they inherit, and how love endures across time. And I am so excited to have this guest on the show, ladies and gentlemen. And I am very excited to have this topic be the topic for the month of May, because it's a topic that I don't think I've had on the show at all. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to our guest today, author and historian, Elijah Stepanovich. Elijah, welcome to the show.
Gabriel, thank you so much for having me. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to showcase my knowledge, and I will talk your ear off about some mythology.
Excellent, Elijah. Excellent. So before we go into our discussion for today, for the viewers now meeting you for the very first time, Elijah, what's a little teaser, a window into who you are that people can expect for possibly future episodes down the road?
So I have a bachelor's degree in political science as well as a bachelor's degree in history. I'm currently an educator in Florida, teaching middle school world history. Father of three, and a husband and an author. I've incorporated Slavic, Norse, Celtic, Greek, and Finnish mythologies into my works of fiction, trying to keep them as historically accurate and mythologically accurate as possible. So I love learning, and I will sit and micro learn and doom scroll in mythology for hours.
Awesome, Elijah. Well, good to know for a future author interview to discuss your works down the road. And actually, let's talk a little bit about that because it perfectly segues into our discussion for today. So, as you just mentioned now, that you're also an author who combines a lot of different mythologies, but you also, as an historian, want to be accurate to how they've been depicted, the stories about them, and more. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so most of us have played God of War, right?
Yes.
We know of Kratos, and in the video game series, he is the God of War. He has killed Ares. He's taken the mantle. But who was Kratos in the actual Greek myths? And he was Zeus's enforcer. He was the one that carried out Prometheus's punishment for giving humans fire. And in my book, in my second book, I actually bring the mythological Kratos into my story. And the the big thing for me is that you don't, with a lot of media out there, and you don't get a chance to really learn about the myths in the correct way. We can look at Marvel, we can look at God of War, Vikings, all these great entertaining mediums, but we don't get an actual chance to see what the actual mythology is. And that's kind of what
Right.
I wanted to incorporate um, into my series, being a historian and teaching these myths. So
Absolutely. Very true, Elijah. And I think that, again, that perfectly segues into our topic for today. Because, viewers and listeners, Elijah and I are going to be talking about the importance of folklore in preserving culture. Because if you do look at it, at one point in time, mythology as we know it was the folklore of the past. That was for them a representation of their culture, and they wanted to preserve that as best as they could. So let's start from the very beginning, Elijah. How do different cultures define and categorize folklore within their traditions?
so we can look at I'll use the Norse traditions for an example, because I think that right now and today is probably the most well known, besides Greek.
Yes.
And um, the Norse tales are split between the Eddas. You have the poetic Edda and the prose Edda,
Mm-hmm.
um, which was written by Snorri Sturluson. He was a Christian. His dad was a pagan. So I think when we're talking about defining and categorizing of folklore within their traditions, um, there's the mythological side, and then there's the heroic side.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you see that a lot in Greece too. But with the Norse, you have, figures like Ragnar, who
Yes.
would go into that heroic side of things. And then, of course, you've got Odin, Thor, Tyr, Loki, Freya, etc. on the mythological side. And I think when we define it and we categorize it for those people during that time, um, we kind of see that throughout history. We see it with the Greeks. We see it, in Homer's Iliad. We see it
Mm-hmm.
in, the Norse Eddas. The Slavs are a little different. They had their heroic epics. Don't get me wrong, and they split it into a few different categories.
Mm.
Um, they split it into, your stories, and then they have more of the what the Norse would call satyr, the magic. They split it into, actual verbal charms, incantations, things like that. And then they'll split it one more time with seasonal rituals. Like you have Yarelo, who is a god of spring.
Right.
Um, so that's the way that I kind of see them categorizing it themselves. And that's something that as historians, we have to really, really focus on so that we don't lose the original message.
Absolutely. 100%. And it is very interesting when you look at, folklore, and most people, generally speaking, when they think of folklore, they tend to think of, more, modern representations of folklore here in the United States, and more so of, Greek, Roman, Norse, Celtic, as more on the mythology side than the folklore, which we'll definitely be talking about later in this discussion of ours. And so, from that point, Elijah, in what ways, in your opinion, does folklore contribute to the identity and the cohesion of a community? Because that is also very important as well. Because if I'm also not mistaken, if I can also remember my own history as a classical historian, was that you had cults of the gods and goddesses, especially looking at Greece and Rome. There was huge communities based around one particular deity of the pantheon.
Well, yeah, and I mean, even if you look at Greece, we'd look at Athens. I mean, each city, each city state, each polis had their founding story within the mythology and
Mm-hmm.
folklore itself. So you're kind of 100% right on that. We look at. I'll give you a prime example. In my book, one of the gods that I have is Aphrodite, and most people see her as Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, lust, love, all of those things. But there was a cult of Aphrodite called Aphrodite Aurea that most people have never heard of, and the Spartans worshipped her not only as the goddess of love, beauty, etc., but the goddess of war as well.
Mm-hmm.
She is known, Rhea. Oh, sorry, my cats are going crazy. Ah, Freya. Anyways, sorry about that. Do we need to start over? Can we edit that?
Oh yeah, no problem, Elijah. I can easily edit this in post.
Okay. So when we look at, the cults like Aphrodite Aurea, which the Spartans worshipped her as Aphrodite the warlike, that's not a lot of things that people pick up on today because it's not really talked about.
Mm-mm.
Um, and I mean, you can go throughout Greece, whether it's Athens, with Athena, Sparta, with a whomever, Apollo or Ares, depending on where you're at in Sparta. Um, and I think that when we look at the identity and the cohesion of the community, that kind of spells it out with those city states and being set up the way they are. And even when we look at the Norse sagas, you have Norway, Sweden, Denmark, even Iceland later on, where we see a lot of prayer to Odin, Thor, and Frey, where it's not quite cultish like it was in Greece.
Right.
Um, but at the same time, they would look at these gods as their area. They wouldn't separate them out in the way that the Western world has become with Christianity and kind of a one God catches all. They would kind of stay in their lane. But for the communities themselves, to answer the second part of this question, I think it was vital to these communities to have that cohesion. I'm sorry, cohesion in their worship, whether it be Thor, Odin, Freya, Perun, whomever in any of the pantheons. It gave them an identity, and you can see that especially with the Anglo-Saxons and the Norse and
Mm-hmm.
Danes going back and forth. Prior to the Christianization of England, we have almost the same gods. I
Yes.
won't say they were the exact same because they were worshipped in different ways in some areas, but they are, for the most part. Odin is Woden, Tyr, Tu, all of that. But it gave them a sense of identity that they could use in their trade, in their wars, whatever they wanted to do.
Absolutely, 100%. And I also think it is very important to note that when it comes to folklore, for a lot of these communities before the creation of, records and books to actually write down these stories, you had someone who was the oral storyteller who
Yes.
kept these traditions alive. And sometimes that was a position in the community that if you were chosen to be the next oral storyteller or the keeper of history, that was a huge honor. And so let's talk a little bit about that, Elijah. What role does oral tradition play in the preservation of folklore across generations? And we can even look at here in the United States when talking about the various indigenous communities that are trying to preserve their culture, their history in a world that's just unfortunately just snuffing those stories away.
Yeah, I mean that the native peoples of the Americas, it's really sad to see how much of their culture has been lost to time and colonization. And without these oral traditions and these spoken stories, would it even exist at this point today? That's a theoretical that we could get
Yeah.
into, but um, I feel like without those oral traditions, the native peoples have lost their sense of identity and their community. We just talked about cohesion in a community. I
Mhm.
mean, for a culture, and we can see it a lot in Slavic culture too, these oral traditions, because we don't have a lot of written um, texts about the
Mhm.
Slavic pagan gods. I think the Russian Chronicle is probably the best preserved manuscript that I know of. But their oral traditions continue even today. If you were to go to rural towns in Russia, even Serbia, Croatia, a lot of these Eastern European places that, even though they're heavily Christianized now, those oral traditions, I was told growing up, if I didn't behave, Baba Yaga was going to come for me.
Mm,
you know? So I think that these oral traditions, without them, we don't have any type of connection to the ancient world, but more so, we don't have a connection to our own cultures.
absolutely. Very, very true. And I think that's probably the one thing that people tend to overlook. It's not just that specific group's history, because it is. It's the history of we as a species, how we have evolved over time, how we have been able to keep the stories and pass them down from one person to another, or sometimes in songs. Songs have also been another avenue to tell
100%.
stories as well before the creation of books, before the creation of scrolls. You even have, in some cases, papyrus being used to keep the records, all of that and more. It's just very, very interesting. And unfortunately, very, very sad that with all of our technological innovations, language and stories have unfortunately been pushed to the sides because they're seen as not important, when in truth they are, because these languages and these stories are not only keepers of history, it also tells us that these people were here, their
Yeah.
story was here, they existed. And now, touching on this particular topic, how can the study of folklore help us as historians understand social and political changes in various cultures?
Oh, I mean, without studying the folklore, you don't understand the movement behind of how we got to where we are today. Not only as a society, but also in political landscapes. And um, my wife always says that culture is nothing more than how people react to certain situations. And
Mm,
that may be a oversimplification, but it's true. And being Slavic, being Serbian, um, I've studied a lot of the political unrest of the fall of Yugoslavia, all the way back to the Christianization of the Slavs.
mm,
And we understand that Perun, who is the thunder god, is now mapped kind of to the prophet Elijah, my namesake. He's known as Elijah the Thunderer. He picked up a lot of traits from Perun.
mm.
Um, Saint Blaze was also took a lot of their traits from Veles, the god of the underworld in Slavic mythology.
Right.
So, you know, without understanding that first bit of Christianization of the Slavic peoples and almost that the beatdown, if you will, that the Slavic peoples have had for hundreds of years, um, going back a millennia. How do you understand the political aspects of why they react the way they do today? Why are they so not trusting of outsiders? Well, historically speaking, it hasn't been good for them.
Mm,
Slavic comes from the same root of the word slave, and there's a reason.
yes.
The Norse enslaved the Slavic peoples. The Romans um, enslaved the Illyrian people of the Balkans. Um, so it's to understand the culture and to look back at the social and political turmoil that has been throughout the world, not only in Europe, but even in like Egyptian folklore, the records of the transitions between the dynasties,
Mm-hmm.
um, is a huge thing. The incorporating certain parts of democracy um, into like Osiris's cult and only having funerary texts exclusive to the pharaohs, those were then adapted to be used by the non-royal elites. Well, why? And although that happened 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, and on, it gives us an idea of who the people were, their culture, and why they react. Because in my own opinion, I personally believe that, and we're getting into a bit of genetics here, but there is ancestral DNA in. I've read a few papers that have not quite confirmed, but have suggested that there is a memory that follows,
Mm,
almost in a sense of an instinctual behavior,
right.
So to me, without studying these things, we can't explain why things are the way they are and why we react the way we do to certain things.
Again, well said, Elijah. Well said. And I think it's also very interesting to note how some figures who have become folklore have changed over time. And I'm going to use an example which leads into our next question. And that is, of course, to looking at the figure of Robin Hood, probably one of the most popular characters in English
Yes.
folklore. Now, everybody knows the story of Robin Hood from what we've been told from pop culture and from the stories from the Tudor era, that he was a dashing rogue who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. But if we look back at the figure of Robin Hood when he was first introduced, he's not this, I don't want to say anti-hero or just a dashing rogue. He was a criminal. He was an outlaw who led a band of renegades against the crown at the time. And it's interesting how when looking at that figure of Robin Hood, a lot of stories and a lot of films nowadays try to paint an semi-accurate depiction of who Robin Hood is, but not wanting to stray too far away because they know Robin Hood stands for, the rich getting robbed and the poor being protected. They don't want to
Yep.
lose what made Robin Hood so iconic. So using Robin Hood as an example, Elijah, are there other examples from other folklores that have been instrumental in maintaining cultural practices during times of oppression? Are there any figures that maybe kind of fit the Robin Hood mold, or maybe even go a little bit further?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about um in the north, with Norse peoples, the Norse traditions survive Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And that version of Christianity was, you know, get baptized or die. And forced conversion during that time, I mean, the Norse people still kept their traditions. They may not have outwardly prayed to Odin in the streets, or asked Thor to bring rain, as much as they didn't want to die, but we still see that has survived through today. And I think Snorri in this case, in my opinion, would kind of be that Robin Hood figure, because without Snorri Sturluson writing down um, all of the Eddas, we have very few things other than the stones that we can
Mm-hmm.
rely on as historians. So um, I would definitely say Snorri would be one that I would compare in that instance to Robin Hood. Um, in the Slavic world, you could argue, um, that Lenin and Stalin in Russia were a big part of keeping the folkloric traditions alive. Now, I'm not going to compare Stalin to Robin Hood, mind you,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but again, without them keeping these traditional epics there, we don't know about them. And it's kind of a fun thing to think about, because without these characters, whether it's Robin Hood, Snorri Sturluson, or Chapoff, writing all of this information down and keeping it safe during times of oppression, um, we don't have that information.
No, we absolutely do not. And you're again, you've said like so many great things, Elijah, because it is true. Without, these stories, the culture would fade away and we would not know anything, because from these stories, from these figures, we can get a sense of who the people were like during that time. And that also then brings into question, as stories have been later adapted and evolved over time through countless chroniclers and more, that begs the question of, is this very accurate to the times of, let's say, in the case of the Joms Vikings from Norse history? The Joms Vikings are probably some of the most interesting figures because they kind of border between real to mythological and folklore, depending on the leader or ruler of the Joms Vikings, and how they had this brotherhood code, which some historians argue may have been a foundation for the Knights Templars during their crusades. You can draw a whole history on that, and it is very, very interesting to learn about that. However, unfortunately, with the times and how folklore and history are interpreted for certain medias, Joms Vikings in particular are seen as just a band of mercenaries or ruthless raiders, and they've been popularized in shows like Vikings and Vikings Valhalla. Now, I love those series. They're really good as entertainment. But if we're trying to say that this was accurate to the times back then, that's when we have to really do a hard stop and examine. And that kind of leads into this next question, Elijah. How has globalization affected the transmission and authenticity of traditional folklore?
And I love this question because it goes back to what I had talked about at the very beginning, with my books, and trying to keep things most as historically accurate as I can while taking as few liberties as I did. And we can look at Marvel. I mean, and we can go back further than just Marvel, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We can go all the way to the comic series, which includes Perun from the Slavic pantheon. It includes Odin and Thor and a bunch of other pagan traditions. And when we look at how the globalization of everything, I think it's twofold here. It's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, yes, we have depictions of these folkloric characters, whether it be the gods or whether it be Ragnar and Rollo, Bjorn,
Mm,
Ivar. Yes, I know the name now, but how many people in the streets are going to know that Ivar never went east? He went west and died in, allegedly, either Dublin or in England. Most people who watch the show, oh, he went and fought the Russians, and of course the Rus not quite being the Russians, but that's a
right.
different story. But on the other hand, it has given us those names.
Hmm.
Thor is one of the most popular Marvel characters.
Yes.
Okay, and I teach middle school, and I ask them all the time, okay, do you know who Osiris is? Do you know who Horus is? No. Okay. Do you know who Thor is? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you know who Loki is? Yeah. Cool. Who is Loki to Thor? That's his brother. No. And but it gives an opportunity, I think, for us in as historians. I think it gives us a unique opportunity to kind of educate as we go along. It's a
Yes.
great, especially as somebody who's in education, it gives us an opportunity to really teach those things. And I, believe it or not, bring my PlayStation in to teach with. And I use Assassin's Creed, their Discovery Tour mode, which is
Yes.
phenomenal, by the way. Ubisoft knocked it out of the park in Odyssey and Origins with that.
Oh yes, 100%.
And but it gives us that opportunity to connect with the next generation and teach them, no, this is actually how these sagas went. So I hate, I shouldn't say hate, I strongly dislike the lack of authenticity to the folklore, but at the same time it broadens the amount of people that may know about it. So
Yeah. Again, that is very true. And we can even look at Thor, which leads into the next question, because Thor in recent years went through a little bit of controversy, especially when we look at the God of War series, specifically God of War Ragnarok.
yes.
Now, for viewers and listeners who don't know this controversy, it's many years ago, but when it was announced God of War Ragnarok was coming out and Thor was going to be one of the characters that not only we would be interacting with, but possibly fighting, a lot of people had issues with the depiction of Thor. Because going to what you said, Elijah, we have this depiction of Thor from Marvel Comics, that he is this very heroic, lean built, blonde, wavy hair hero. But if you look
Yes.
at Thor in God of War Ragnarok, he's none of those things. He is a drunkard. He is and sometimes a warmonger. He is pretty much a servant of his father who just treats him horribly. And I remember a lot of people had a lot of issues with Thor. But if you look back at the records of Thor and how he's depicted in the sagas and in the epics, yes, the studio did take a lot of creative liberties, but you cannot argue that this is probably the most likely action of Thor in recent media, and we think is Mjolnir. A lot of us believe from the comic world Mjolnir helps Thor fly. In the God of War game, which I'm going back to trying to remember, he necessarily doesn't use it to fly in a sense. He can throw it and it will send his enemy very, very far, and he can definitely go after. But it doesn't necessarily mean he needs it to fly. So tying this all back in, Elijah, and maybe you can also talk a little bit more about your book in relation to this question. In what ways do literary and artistic adaptations of folklore or folkloric figures contribute to or detract from the original meaning and source material?
So, and I think you pretty much hit it all on the head. And to go back to the previous statement I had, again, it gives us an opportunity to kind of educate. But with the, I don't think they necessarily contribute, I will say, as much as they do detract from the original story. Because when we look at Marvel's Thor, that's what people think of when you say Thor.
Yes.
Me personally, I looked at God of War Ragnarok version. I got excited when I saw it because I'm like, this is a mythologically accurate depiction. You think of I was a huge wrestling guy back when I was a kid. All right. And there was a wrestler by the name of Mark Henry, went by the world's strongest man. He's not cut. He's not, skinny with muscles. He is a solid block of a human being. And you look at and you think of like the world's strongest man competitions, and these guys don't look like Marvel's Thor. They look like God of War Ragnarok's Thor. And as a ginger myself, I loved the fact that they were able to put all of that together, because that's to me what mythologically accurate Thor is. He drank the ocean. I mean, you can't. This is where the detraction comes in, because I feel like it really does kind of supplant the actual mythology. It
Right.
becomes almost this new mythology in a way, and it's it's awesome that we get to talk about it, but at the same time, I think the detraction from its original meaning far outweighs the contributions that are made.
Absolutely. I think we can also add a little bit further before we go into our next question is that we can look at movies, film, and comic books as a way to introduce
Yes.
mythology to the next generation. But we have to understand that this is not the actual representation of these figures from mythology and folklore. These are artistic representations to at least inspire people. And we can even look at Marvel in recent years, where you have, the expanded background of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, how it's tied to Egyptian mythology. And even looking at DC Comics, DC Comics has its own depiction of the Greek pantheon as well. So it is
Yes.
very, very fascinating. But again, to wrap it all up, it's a good avenue to introduce people to these characters, but for the historians and all of us, we should note that these are not the actual depictions of these characters or of this culture. This is a artistic representation or an exaggeration to a degree. And
Yes.
going into the next question, which kind of segues into this, how can folklore serve as a vehicle for individual expression within a larger cultural framework?
So, trying to think of this, because I'm very well versed with Slavic, Norse, Greek, etc. And when we look at the Mesopotamian mythology, we can look at the flood narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that being added into the Epic of Gilgamesh, and then of course later into the Holy Bible. It kind of reshapes, as far as Gilgamesh goes. It's the acceptance of morality, you know, um, and that's represented through that literary vision that the scribes had.
Right.
And from a today's standpoint, from a larger cultural framework, it gives us an opportunity as historians to kind of connect the dots. And a prime example of that is I'm very interested in Proto-Indo-European
Mm.
gods, okay, and mythology. And there are a lot of speculation going back, with words. Perun, for a prime example, going back to Perkunos, um, in the Proto-Indo-European pantheon of gods. So I think from a larger cultural framework, it gives us that opportunity to kind of see those connections, to see how we got to where we are today.
Yes. Very true. And this kind of goes into the next question, which you may have already touched on before, but maybe we can go a little bit more in depth. And that is, what challenges do you think historians face when documenting and analyzing folklore in a rapidly changing society?
Ugh, I mean, with the advent of technology, TikTok and YouTube, and being able to connect so quickly, but also losing your audience just as quickly. It's a very big challenge when, as historians, when we are trying to document and analyze folklore, And I could even push this out even at a bigger, broader spectrum, looking at governments. What's important to governments? We had the Islamic State not too long ago destroy important historical archaeological sites. Wars that are constantly changing. How fast can we do archaeological research? How fast can we take these documents that are housed in museums, libraries, and elsewhere and protect them when society's wants and needs, and by society I mean governmental wants and needs and what the
Right.
governments believe is important? How do we continue to keep that line of research safe, funded, and accessible?
Yes, absolutely. Very, very true, Elijah. And I actually remember I was talking with a colleague of mine, I want to say a year or two ago, about, the preservation of history. And she studies Coptic history in Egypt. And we were talking about just briefly about the film Agora and talking about how the burning of the Library of Alexandria, some argue, set human history and folklore and traditions centuries back. And some have even gone even forward and said, had the library not burned, not only would we have records of people and cultures that existed around the same time as the most powerful, the Romans, Ptolemaic, beginning of the Byzantines, Sassanids, and many more, we would also be advanced as a culture and as a society as a whole. But unfortunately, powers that be at the time viewed the Library of Alexandria as a threat, and unfortunately was burned to the ground. Knowledge lost to the records for all time. It is in the tragedies of history in regards to the preservation of history, it's one of the biggest losses to the field.
100%.
Mm-hmm.
And
And oh, go ahead.
no, you're good. Go ahead. You're good.
I was actually gonna say, and maybe you can actually, I think you kind of may have touched a little bit on this, but in regard to the different mediums like stories, songs, and of course dances, we haven't touched on those yet. How do these mediums impact the preservation and longevity of folklore?
Well, I can tell you, I mean, I'm going to use Slavic folklore as an example here because um, Skaski is a they call it well, it's a song that is sung in Slavic cultures, and even though most Slavic peoples will identify with either the Orthodoxy or the Catholic Church, that is something that comes from those times pre-Christian, and that has maintained for thousands of years, regardless of who has been over top, whether it's the Habsburgs, whether it was the Ottomans, those type of cultural stories, songs, dances like the kolo. Um, they they keep that culture known, and I think it's not only again Slavic. We see that throughout the different types of folklore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, we could talk about Roman pragmatism if you wanted to. I mean, there's um, the pyramid texts in Egypt that survived thousands of years, um, that have musical traditions, dance traditions, um, also being painted on the side of tombs. So, I feel like song and dance, those type of mediums impact the preservation of the folklore. I would almost argue longer than the stories do, just because they continue to happen regardless of what the belief system is.
Mm-hmm. Very true. And we even look in our own history, probably, and kind of we talked about, trying to fight oppression, to keep culture alive, is the ghost dance movement in our own nation's
Yeah.
history, and fortunately resulted in the massacre of the native people of the Americas, because the people and the army at the time did not understand what the movement was about, or did, and blew it up into proportions than it needed to be. And that has now become synonymous in our own history. That is one of the many things that we will never, ever wipe away. But we also can acknowledge that a lot of these dances have also still survived in the wake of other tragedies around the world. And not only are they a way to preserve the culture of the people, they're also inspired by, the folklores of their past, the mythology, and many more, to again inspire and instill a sense of community and unity in an ever-changing world, which honestly I think would not be such a bad thing to have in today's time.
I agree 100%.
Absolutely. And kind of still in the realm of historians, what methods do you think historians use to validate the authenticity and historical significance of folklore? And this question for me is very, very interesting, because it does raise a lot of other branching points when we look at, authenticity and where it fits in the overall story of either a culture or of a people.
Yeah, and I mean, we can definitely look at Snorri Sturluson, for example. Um, when we look at what he's written, do we know that that is exactly what the Norse peoples believed in? The peoples of Scandinavia, is that what they believed in? Because this was written by a Christian. Is there that Christian bias? And I think when we look at authenticity and the historical significance, we have, with any historical document, you have to account for bias, point of view, and all of that.
Yes.
So I think it's not so much what happened as it is what the story is telling you about that culture.
Yes.
And I can sit here and talk about Slavic folklore till your ears fall off. But there are different parts of Slavic folklore. There's Russian, Ukrainian, Balkan, many different, all dependent upon geography and locale. And another one that I can also look at is Finnish mythology.
Mm.
Up until the Kalavea was rewritten and, well, actually written down, I should say, in the 1800s, we don't know anything really about Finnish paganism. We don't know about Ukko or Tuonela or Lemminkainen or Vainamoinen. And I have to give Tolkien a huge props for this, because it was him and his studies in creating Lord of the Rings and the Elvish language that actually helped Finland during their time of oppression and then eventual independence with Russia, because he studied so far into their language and folklore that he created this wonderful character by the name of Gandalf, who was based off of Vainamoinen from the Kalavea.
Yes, absolutely. There could be a whole discussion just on Tolkien and his works connection to real history and real culture and more, which honestly wouldn't be a bad episode. So viewers and listeners, if you would like to see that episode and have me and Elijah talk about Tolkien and history, like this video, comment, and subscribe to the channel. So you're absolutely right, Elijah. It is very, very true. And now we talked about artistic contributions and in some way detractions to folklore and mythologies, can the same be said for technology in regards to preservation and dissemination in contemporary culture?
I think when we look at the preservation of information, I think technology has been a huge boon for us in the historical and archaeological fields because, and I can give you my own personal journey of learning my family history. Without the digitized information, I could not afford to travel to all the certain places that I needed to find all that out. My grandfather or great grandfather came through Ellis Island. My great grandmother came through Ellis Island. All of those records are now digitized through Family Search and NARA. Um, so I think technology has gotten to a point where it has become a huge boon, at least in the preservation of information, documents, because no matter what, if there was a burning of the Library of Alexandria again, we would have digital copies. And I
Right.
do think that is huge for our field. Um, the dissemination of folklore, um, I think it's given us a new opportunity with different mediums. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
going all the way back, to the advent of the radio here.
Right.
But there's radio stations that will broadcast in Europe different folk music that is traditional to that people's, whether it be Serbia, Finland, wherever. And I think that's really a cool kind of thing too. And then another thing is I'm a huge metal fan. I love metal. You have bands like Amon Amarth who go out and they talk about Norse mythology, Thor, Crack the Blackened Sky, type deal where they kind of preserve the culture as well and the folklore um, through a different medium in technology.
Yes, absolutely. And kind of a little tangent to that, a group that's also very, very similar in terms of, preserving history and bringing history to life is, if I am correct, it's Sabatune, which I absolutely
Yes.
love that band. Their songs are some of the best I have ever heard, from Steel Commanders, uh, Devil Dogs, Shiroyama, and many, many more. Haven't heard of their new songs yet, but yeah, very much so. As the band you were talking about, Elijah Sabatune, brings history to life, keeps these histories alive, and presents in a way which is engaging as well as welcoming, because you don't have to be an historian or a history buff to appreciate the history behind the song. You should just go there just for the music. And let's be honest, that music is amazing.
Yeah. 100%. 100%. And
Absolutely.
I've got friends that, are Christian, but they'll still go to Amon Amarth concerts and they will jam out and scream, row, row, and it's just kind of cool to see those, transcend different cultures in a sense.
Very true, Elijah. Very true. So we now reach the final two questions in this incredible Historians Lounge episode. I'm actually going to combine them together because they actually do fit rather well. So we talked about a lot of things in this episode, Elijah, that I think have been very eye-opening and have definitely broken some myths about folklore and mythology, and have also, as I like to call it, the three E's: educate, entertain, and enlighten people. So ultimately, from our discussions and in your hopes, how does the interpretation of folklore change over time within a culture, and the factors contributing this to its evolution? And what do you think is the relation between folklore and national identity, particularly in multicultural societies?
All right. So I don't necessarily notice the interpretation of folklore change just by itself. Again, we look at the USSR, the Soviet era, and they brought a lot of their folklore with them. Brought it back, banned Christianity, consider themselves to be atheist societies, but kept the folklore alive.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily think that it changed, but a big thing, Baba Yaga, she's the witch, okay? She's ugly and all these things. However, if we go back and we look at the text, she was not this hideous of a woman that's going to come steal your kids and beat them to death, okay? She was a very beautiful woman who actually went and helped heroes and helped kids and did all these things if we read the Russian folklore. But that Christianization over time, okay, well, they change her into the swamp witch in the woods. And
Yes.
that's a prime example that we see. And in my book, Baba Yaga makes an appearance. And while I keep her iron teeth, I also show her as the mother, not the witch. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So as far as national identity, let's look at Yugoslavia for a minute. You have Muslims, Christians, pagans, Jews, all living in one society. But even though they tried, and Tito was able to keep them united for the most part, that folklore and national identity stayed with the republics.
Mm-hmm.
That national identity of Serbia, okay? Kosovo, if you ask nationalistic Serbians, Kosovo is still Serbia. Okay. So Kosovo is seen as a sacred Serbian territory because of the folklore and the history of
Mm-hmm.
Serbia. And I'm not saying that the Serbs are correct in their interpretation of Kosovo. But the folklore doesn't change, but the history behind it makes it's the entire reason that Russia is trying to claim Ukraine. That connected peoples, we have the shared folklore. It's pretty much Russian land to begin with because we were here first, although the Rus were there much longer or much before. But I think when we look at nationalistic ideals of folklore, it has been used in a way throughout history, not necessarily in a good way. You know, we could bring up Nazi Germany, the way that they took so many symbols. The swastika, you and I know that the swastika was a symbol of peace and prosperity.
Yes, it was.
And it was taken and changed into this horrific symbol of mass murder. And it's hard for us as historians because it's like, well, they adapted that symbol, and we see it in white nationalism here in the United States. You can look at the Kolvorat in Slavic mythology, that is the sun wheel, and they've changed it into the black sun. And it's kind of a tragedy in my opinion, because these are gorgeous symbols, gorgeous knotworks that belonged to certain cultures that meant the complete opposite of what people are identifying that nationalistic identity with.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same token, when we look at just a national identity, without that folklore, are the Slavs still the Slavs? Are the Illyrians now the Albanians, or are they still Illyrians? You know, that's a hell of a question, man. I love that so much.
And it's not an easy question to answer because it raises so many discussions, so many interpretations of, what does it mean to be, who we are. And to your point, like if you remove let's look at the Romans. If you removed all the Greek influences that the Romans borrowed, let's face it, they probably just they stole it
Copy
pretty
your
much.
homework.
Yeah. Yeah. Would they still be who they are? Would the Romans be the Romans as we know them now without the Greek influence? And it's a lot. It's a lot to consider. And we can even argue, would Western Europe be as it is if Rome never existed? Because what a lot of people do not know, and tying into folklore and mythology, what we know as Germany, what we know as France, Spain, Britain, and a little bit of Scotland, they all had little inklings of Romanism, adapted it to their culture, combined it with their mythology, their language, their practices to give them a distinct identity. And even going forward, we look at Britain, it's very, very different. You could argue, or actually, you can say that pretty much the Welsh are the closest to what the original Britons were. What we know as
Yes.
Anglo-Saxons were the German migrants who left Saxony, who came to Britain, mixed in with the local population to create the Anglo-Saxons. And then you had the Norse, then you had the Normans, and that whole thing. So it is very interesting. And if you were to take all of that, would Great Britain be the country that it is now? Who's to say? Who is to say? The transmission of languages and histories would have definitely existed, but at the rate and at the height and just how much, it leads one to the imagination. And we can go into a full discussion on that. But we are going to end it here, viewers and listeners. Thank you all so much for joining us for an incredible episode here of the Historians Lounge. I want to give a huge thank you to Elijah for coming on the show, making his official debut. Now, Elijah, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out and connect, as well as buy a copy or two of your books?
So you can, my name, that is my username on almost everything. I do have a link tree on my Insta and TikTok that you can go to. It has all my links on it. My books are available, again, ElijahStepanovich.com. That'll take you everywhere you need to do. If you have Kindle Unlimited, it is available there as well. And I do have my DMs open for my readers. So if you have any questions, feel free. My wife and I are doing Mythology Mondays on TikTok every Monday at 8 o'clock. We try to jump on. So other than that, the Shattered Veil series is the name of my book. That's the series. Book 3 is The Legacy of Ash and Thunder. It'll be launching June 6th. I mean, it's got dystopian. It's got a bunch of gods from different pantheons. But Gabriel, thank you so much for having me on. Anytime you would love to have me back, I'd love to be back.
Absolutely, Elijah. And as I said earlier in the video, viewers and listeners, if you would like to see Elijah back on the show and possibly a continuation of our discussion here at the Historians Lounge, or in an author interview where myself and Elijah go more in depth into his book series, you have to do. Like this video, comment down below, and subscribe to the channel. I'll be linking all of his social media down below in the description of this video, as well as the links of where to buy his books. And until next time, This has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, signing out. Wish you all a wonderful evening wherever you are in the world. Have a good day, everybody, and we'll see you all next time.